I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now and really hear this first sentence. My mother was on a home medical ventilator in our spare bedroom, keeping her alive, and my HOA president shut off the power to our unit knowing that because our porch light was the wrong color. Let that sit for a moment. Not a noise complaint, not an unauthorized fence, not a paint color dispute, a porch light. A single bulb in a fixture on my front porch that was apparently 3 degrees too warm on the color spectrum compared to the community standard. And a woman named Cheryl Voss decided that was worth more than my mother's next breath. This is the story of what happened after that, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you will understand why Cheryl Voss no longer lives in that neighborhood, why her name appears in a county public record that will follow her for the rest of her life, and why there is now a dedicated emergency medical accommodation clause in the HOA governing documents of Pinecrest Commons that will protect every vulnerable resident who comes after my mother. Buckle up. My name is Nathaniel Cross. I'm 41 years old. I work in logistics management. And 3 years ago, my mother, Elena, came to live with us after a progressive neuromuscular condition left her dependent on a home ventilator to breathe through the night. The machine was not optional. The machine was not a convenience. Without it, she had a window of roughly 4 to 6 minutes before the situation became irreversible. Our pulmonologist had documented everything. Our power company had us on their medical priority list, meaning in the event of an outage, they were required to restore our power before non-medical residences. We had a backup battery that provided approximately 2 hours of emergency ventilator operation. We had protocols. We had plans. We had done everything right. What we had not planned for was Cheryl Voss. Cheryl was 58 years old, recently retired, and had been HOA president of Pinecrest Commons for 6 years. She was the kind of woman who sent violation notices for garden hose storage and kept a spreadsheet of every resident's lawn mowing schedule. She had once called a special board meeting to address a resident's wind chime. She was not cruel in an obvious way. She was procedural. She hid everything behind the handbook, behind the bylaws, behind the laminated authority of her HOA president badge. She believed sincerely and completely that the rules existed to serve her interpretation of them and that her interpretation was always correct. I had filed the appropriate paperwork when my mother moved in. I had notified the HOA in writing that we had a medical device dependent resident, that the unit required uninterrupted power, and that any planned maintenance affecting our electrical supply required 48 hours advance notice per the Americans with Disabilities Act accommodation guidelines. The HOA acknowledged the letter. I have the email confirmation. I printed it and kept it in a folder, because by that point I had been living at Pinecrest Commons for 2 years. And I had learned that with Cheryl Voss you kept everything in a folder. The porch light incident started 3 weeks before everything collapsed. Cheryl knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon and informed me, pleasantly and precisely, that my porch light fixture was using a bulb with a color temperature of approximately 3000 Kelvin, warm white, while the community standard specified 4000 Kelvin, cool white. She handed me a violation notice. I thanked her, told her I would address it, and closed the door. I did not address it immediately because my mother had a difficult week and I had more important things to think about than light bulb color temperature. I intended to change it on the weekend. Cheryl sent a follow-up notice on Thursday, then another on Saturday, then on Monday morning. 9 days after the first notice, she filed what the HOA governing documents called an Emergency Community Standards Action, which theoretically existed to address urgent safety hazards like structural damage or fire risks. She had used it to authorize an immediate utility interruption to my unit until the violation was resolved. I was at work when it happened. My wife Sarah was home with my mother. At 10:47 a.m., the power to our unit cut out completely. Sarah had approximately 4 minutes to get the backup battery connected and operational before the ventilator lost power entirely. She did it in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I know this because she was shaking so badly that she dropped the battery cable once and had to pick it up off the floor, and her hands were trembling so hard she could barely align the connector. She told me this afterward, very quietly, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, staring at nothing. I got the call from her at 10:51 a.m. I was in my car by 10:52. By the time I arrived home, the backup battery had my mother stable. The ventilator was running, and Sarah was sitting beside the bed holding my mother's hand while my mother, who understood what had happened, was watching her daughter-in-law with an expression I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was not fear. It was something quieter than fear. The expression of a person who had just understood very clearly how close the margin was. I walked back outside. I crossed the street. I knocked on Cheryl Voss's door. She answered with her clipboard. "Mr. Cross," she said, already pulling out a document. "I understand there may be some concern about the maintenance action this morning, but the governing documents clearly provide for—" "Cheryl," I said. My voice was very quiet. "My mother almost died this morning. The machine that keeps her breathing lost her power because of what you did. I have a letter on file with this HOA notifying you of her medical equipment dependency. I have your email confirmation acknowledging that letter. I have the ADA accommodation documents, and I have a backup battery log showing the power cut at 10:47 and restoration at 10:51. She opened her mouth. "I'm not here to discuss the porch light," I said. "I'm here to tell you that what you did this morning may constitute criminal endangerment under state statute. I will be speaking with an attorney this afternoon." I turned around and walked back across the street. The power to our unit was restored within the hour. I did not change the porch light bulb. The attorney that I reached that afternoon was a woman named Patricia Shelton, who specialized in HOA law and disability rights. She listened to the entire situation without interrupting, asked four precise questions, and then told me that what Cheryl Voss had done potentially violated the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and depending on the state's criminal statutes, could rise to the level of reckless endangerment. She told me to document everything, preserve every communication, and not to speak with Cheryl or any HOA board members without her present. I had already been documenting everything. That folder I mentioned, the one I kept because I had learned about Cheryl, had 2 years of material in it: violation notices, my responses, board meeting minutes, the original medical accommodation letter, the email confirmation, the power company's medical priority registration, the backup battery log, my wife's account of the morning, were written out by hand and dated. Patricia filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA regulatory authority within the week. She filed a separate complaint with the County Human Rights Commission. She sent a legal notice to the HOA board informing them of potential liability exposure that, in her professional opinion, was significant enough to warrant immediate review of their insurance coverage. The HOA board, 5 people, 3 of whom had never particularly liked Cheryl's management style, but had never found the specific moment to say so, held an emergency meeting 4 days later. Cheryl was not invited to chair it. What happened over the following 3 weeks moved faster than I had expected, and slower than I wanted simultaneously. The State Regulatory Authority opened a formal investigation. The County Human Rights Commission contacted us for a full statement. The HOA board voted to place Cheryl on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the investigations, which was not quite the same as removing her, but meant she had no authority to issue notices, authorize actions, or represent the community in any capacity. The generator convoy was not something I planned or organized. I want to be clear about that. It started with my neighbor across the street, a retired firefighter named Dennis, who heard what had happened from Sarah. Dennis told 2 other neighbors. Those 2 told 4 more. Within a week, 11 households on our street had quietly coordinated to purchase or borrow portable generators and connect them in an informal neighborhood network designed to ensure that if our power was ever interrupted again by Cheryl, by weather, by anything, my mother's ventilator would have backup power from 11 independent sources simultaneously. On the Saturday morning they set it up. They did it without fanfare. Just 11 neighbors with extension cords and generators and quiet determination, working in the street outside our house for 3 hours, while Dennis walked them through the connection sequence. Cheryl watched from her window. Nobody looked at her window. Nobody needed to. The sight of 11 generators lined up along the street, connected and ready, was the most purely human thing I have witnessed in my adult life. Not loud, not dramatic, just neighbors doing what neighbors are supposed to do. Cheryl Voss resigned from the HOA board the following Monday morning. The letter cited health reasons. The state regulatory finding issued 8 weeks later determined that the Emergency Community Standards section had been improperly applied and that the failure to observe the filed medical accommodation constituted a violation of federal disability protection guidelines. The HOA was required to implement mandatory medical accommodation training for all board members and to include a permanent emergency medical resident protection clause in their governing documents. Cheryl was permanently barred from serving in any HOA board capacity in the state. My mother is still with us. She still uses the ventilator at night. She sits in the garden on good afternoons and waves at Dennis when he mows his lawn, and he always waves back with the particular warmth of someone who knows exactly that that wave means. The porch light is still 3000 Kelvin, warm white. I have never changed it and I never will. If this story moved you, if you believe that the rules should never be more powerful than the people they are supposed to protect, subscribe, because there are more stories waiting, and every single one of them ends with the truth winning.